social history. Anytime we have economic change, this is going to lead to social change. Average income is skyrocketing, but this is just an average. In reality, a few people are getting incredibly rich, and the vast majority of Americans are probably getting poor. Slaves, farmers, landless agricultural workers, and unskilled labor saw no increase in their wages. Merchants and industrialists are amassing gigantic fortunes. The rich parts of town begin to become opulent. They found clubs, create social organizations, and they buy expensive carriages and drive them around town to show off their wealth. This is kind of the, today, of course, there's this huge emphasis on having a really expensive, fancy car. Back then, it was a carriage. They build great mansions. They throw expensive parties. Central Park in New York City was built specifically for the rich people to have a place to go show everybody their fancy carriages. Central Park was originally created as a place to show off for the rich. But of course, they weren't alone in the cities. They shared cities with an army of destitute workers, or people who didn't have a job at all. There were many, many, many homeless in the cities. Many required either charity or crime to feed themselves. Death by starvation or exposure were common. It would be totally normal to walk around New York City and see somebody who was starved to death lying on the streets, or in the winter, frozen to death. Recent immigrants, widows, orphans, alcoholics, the mentally ill, the Irish, and free blacks were the most common victims of this sort of poverty. Blacks in the North were free, but they were poor, and they were banned from doing most jobs. They could not vote, they couldn't use public services, and they were probably materially worse off than slaves. I want to be careful here. Being a slave, I think, is worse because you don't have your freedom. But in terms of how much they ate, their clothing, their living conditions, a free black in the North was worse off than a slave. Life was better than it had been, and better than it was in Europe. So there was a little class conflict. Things were improving. As bad as this was, it had been worse before. And if you came here from Ireland, everybody was starving to death over there anyway. And so the poor did not seem to have a sense of revolution, of wanting more even distribution. And we did here in America, we focused on the limited amount of social mobility. Any story about somebody starting poor and doing remotely okay became kind of an American legend. And this American dream was really a pacifier. Well, you're poor now and you don't have anything, but just work hard, kid, and maybe one day you'll be living in one of those mansions. It didn't really happen. There was not that sort of social mobility. If you're poor, you're probably going to be poor your whole life. But the idea was important to keeping discontent low. Another thing you may not realize is people were extremely mobile. You moved around a lot. In fact, people were probably more mobile back then than they are today. If you couldn't find work in one city, you would pack up and go to another one. And so I think we have this idea that people used to be born on a farm and live there their whole life and die there. That wasn't true. People moved around a lot. Let's start with the middle class. This was a small group, but it was the fastest growing group. These are shop owners, managers, craftsmen. Land used to be the only basis for wealth, how much land you own, because everybody was a farmer, but not anymore. Now you could have a shop, or like where you sold stuff, or a shop where you make stuff, and this could be the basis for your wealth. Middle class houses began popping up in city streets, not in suburbs. They're in the town. They're downtown. Middle class folks tended to own their home, not rent it. These were bigger than the row houses the poor lived in, but they were much smaller than the mansions that the rich lived in. Women tended not to work. Many middle class folks would be expected to have immigrant servant girls to take care of the household chores. There were no household appliances, so housework was overwhelming. In the 1840s, the cast iron stove was invented and replaced open fires, which meant fewer houses burned down. But more importantly, it allowed you to cook multiple dishes at once, so you could have dinner where you had lots of different dishes. The railroad meant that you were getting all kinds of different foods, grains and meats and dairy products, although fruit and vegetables, which go bad fairly quickly, were still limited. Ice boxes, or what you call refrigerators, but of course there was no electricity, so this literally meant like an ice chest in your kitchen, were still relatively rare. Most food at the time was preserved through dehydrating or canning, or packing in salt, like beef jerky. Diets were heavy and starchy, and middle-class people tended to be what we would call today fat. But at the time, that was considered attractive. The style of the day was Victorian. Here you see examples of Victorian architecture, which is very ornate. And here we're going to see some Victorian clothing. Victorian furnishing was cluttered. The rooms were dark. The fabrics were lush. They were soft, and you kind of sunk into them. The furniture was heavy. The houses were segmented. Today it's very popular to have an open floor plan where there's very few walls. Back then the rooms were very clearly divided and fairly claustrophobic. Middle-class kids did tend to have their own rooms and beds. Most people before this, there was just one big room. And then you would probably have a separate parlor and a dining room. A parlor where you would hang out and visit, and a dining room, of course, where you would eat. In the 1850s, urban homes began to have plumbing as well. So that's nice. We'll get to that in a minute. Work shifts. Work had been in the home. Now think about a farm. On a farm, there is no distinction between work and home. It's all the same thing. But when you create a factory or a store, and somebody leaves their home to go to work, you create these two different worlds that we think of today, work and home. And this is really going to impact the Americans and the world's psychology. And we live in that world today. We're going to talk a lot more about that as we go along. In 1800, the average woman gave birth 7 times in her life. By 1860, that number has dropped down to 5 births. Let's talk about women. On a farm, women had a clear role. When you go into this new world where there's home and there's work, women are no longer involved in the work. On a farm, women did a lot of work. But now they've lost their role. They've lost their place. They have fewer rights than men. In a sense, they're property, if you look at the way their rights are structured. They're rarely educated beyond primary education. And we invent this world where there's these two different spheres. The kind of work sphere, where the man now occupies, and the woman has nothing to do, and so she creates a domestic sphere. And so the house, the raising of children, become the woman's responsibility. It wasn't like that before. We assumed it's always been like this. But farm life wasn't like that. Work and the rearing of children in the home were shared by both parents as responsibilities. But those are going to be split here as we create this new economy. Women can get an education. In 1837, Oberlin in Ohio becomes the first school to accept female students, co-eds. Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts will shortly after that become the first all-women's college. But few women go to college. Most women simply get married and then stay home. They become the protector of morality and the maintainer of home life. And they need a purpose. And so they begin to take pride in appearance and entertaining and having a very nicely decorated house and being well dressed and having your makeup just right becomes the kind of thing a woman now takes pride in. Whereas before, of course, a woman was an equal member of a team in a rural setting. Romance novels will become all the rage, and they will focus on this new middle-class woman, and women will take to these with great enthusiasm. Magazines will begin to appear about shopping, homemaking, fashion, and women begin to become more and more cut off from the outside world. Women are, in some sense, prisoners of their nice new houses. The only respectable jobs a woman can hold are teaching and nursing. A middle-class woman or an upper-class woman doing any of this other type of work is going to be looked down on. The idea of the middle-class family is that the husband be so successful that the woman doesn't have to work. This is a great favor back in the day. Men were very proud if their woman didn't have to work. Now, what if you're a woman and you wanted a career? You wanted to interact with other adults. You wanted to go out into the world. Well, that was shameful for your husband because you were supposed to stay at home. Of course, poor women worked anyway. Poor women had to, those people need to eat, right? And so poor women were out there working in terrible conditions in factories or as a middle-class or upper-class woman's domestic servant. Leisure time. What do we do for fun? Well, Sundays are for God and rest. And, of course, you worked 6.5 or 6 days a week, so there were no real other times. The shops weren't open on Sunday, and that was the only time you might have off. And so basically there wasn't a whole lot of leisure time. Holidays were really important because of this, because holidays were, in a 6-day week, an extra day off here and there really meant a lot. Of course, there weren't that many of them, and all of them were religious, which meant none of the stores were going to be open except for one, the 4th of July. And the 4th of July was really, really important in American culture back then because it was the only non-religious holiday. Now, in farm life, you had natural holidays. You had days off because let's say it rained, or right after you bring the harvest in, there's really nothing to do after you sell it anyway. You have this downtime period. In the winter, when it's too cold to do anything outside, you have downtime. But in the urban world, those factory owners wanted those factories running all the time. And so there is no downtime. Men tended to go to taverns after work, so you work your 12-hour day and you stop off for a drink on the way home. And women tended to meet in homes and social clubs. They would get together and have tea and lunches and things like this. The top leisure activity in the country is reading. Newspaper, magazines, books all become common, and they become a sign of affluence. If you go to someone's house and they've got a lot of magazines on the coffee table or a bookshelf full of books, that's a way of them saying, look, we've made it. We've got a lot of disposable income. The theater, melodrama would be would be very popular, and these are kind of really, really over the top, dramatic books, kind of this emotional pornography, if you will, with these crazy twists and turns and love stories and stuff. American mythology is very popular. George Washington and how he never told a lie and cut down the cherry tree and all that stuff. Shakespeare was also very popular as well, interestingly enough. And of course, if you wanted, you could go out to the vaudeville show. These were extremely racist. These were white guys who would dress up like black people and then kind of act like idiots, because that's how white people saw black people. Here is an ad for makeup where you yourself could dress up in what they called blackface. This was very, very popular entertainment in the North and the South at the time. We're going to begin to see the first of America's obsession with sports, which is going to grow over time. Boxing is the most popular sport. Notice they're not wearing gloves. Racing, horse racing that is, cockfighting are very popular. And we begin to see the first amateur baseball games that begin to attract large crowds, particularly in New York City. There are no photographs, and there's no internet. So if you're curious about the world, you have to go somewhere and look at stuff, and of course it has to come to you. And so freak shows are very common. Freak shows were a great way for people at the time to go see something different. Think about all the different crazy things you look at on the internet today. Well, they didn't have that back then. So if somebody brought this group of interesting people or acts or whatever it was to your town, you were probably going to go. They would also bring exotic animals, maybe an elephant or a giraffe, something you literally could not see because the photography hadn't even been invented yet. And so these circuses and freak shows would regularly sell out. P.T. Barnum's American Museum in 1842 focused on the freaks. Tom Thumb, who's this little bitty guy here, Siamese twins, magicians, ventriloquists. His circus, by the way, doesn't come until 1870, the one that travels around the country. But you could go to Times Square in New York City in 1842 and see his freaks. Another popular form of entertainment would be lectures. If you're particularly knowledgeable on a topic, or maybe you've traveled somewhere interesting to China or something, or you're just entertaining. Mark Twain, for example, in a later era, would become incredibly famous and popular through this. You would give lectures, and people would go to see you because there was no Wikipedia. There weren't easily available reference books and stuff. Political lectures also. We're about to get into the period where Frederick Douglass will go around the North lecturing on what it was like to be a slave. And he would sell out lecture halls because how else are you going to get this information? And so entertainment was much different than we think of it today. And it gives us a moment here to reflect on how modern technology has changed our view of entertainment.